There are things in Egypt that don't fully make sense. Massive stone structures built with precision we still question. Hidden chambers sealed behind walls. Objects carved so perfectly, they feel out of place in their time. And the deeper you look, the stranger it gets. Because these aren't myths. They're real discoveries. Scanned, measured, studied, and still not completely understood. In this video, we're going through some of the most unexplained mysteries of ancient Egypt, from hidden voids inside pyramids and underground stone boxes, to strange artifacts and structures that don't fully match what we expect. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is right now. And if this kind of mystery pulls you in, make sure to subscribe, because what you're about to see might change how you look at ancient history. The tomb where human bodies had bird-like features, the tomb of the birdmen. A tomb sealed beneath layers of sand hidden long enough to remain untouched. The kind of find that has been made many times across Egypt, each one adding another piece to a history that is already vast. But this one feels different, because what was found inside doesn't fully match expectations, and that difference is where the mystery begins. This is often referred to as the tomb of the birdmen, and what makes it stand out is not just the structure itself, but the unusual features associated with the remains found inside, because descriptions suggest bodies that appear altered, shaped, or presented in ways that resemble something beyond standard human form, and that immediately raises questions, because burial in ancient Egypt followed patterns, careful preparation, specific rituals, processes repeated with precision, and when something doesn't follow that pattern, it becomes noticeable. The tomb itself is not dramatically different from others, cut into the ground, structured with chambers, designed to contain and preserve what was placed inside. And that familiarity makes the contrast even stronger, because the setting feels normal, but the details do not. The remains described within the tomb appear to have features that don't fully align with typical human proportions, particularly in the shape of the skull, or the positioning of certain elements, creating an impression that has been interpreted as bird-like. And that interpretation is important, because it is based on observation, on how the remains appear, but appearance does not always equal origin, and that distinction matters, because there are known practices that can alter how a body looks over time, natural processes, post-burial changes, preservation conditions. All of these can affect form, and yet even with those explanations, the descriptions continue to stand out, because they don't fully settle the question. The idea of combining human and animal traits is not unfamiliar in Egyptian culture. Representations exist, symbols, figures that merge human bodies with animal heads, often used to express meaning, belief, or identity. And that context adds another layer, because it shows that the concept itself was present. But representation is not the same as physical reality, and that difference is critical, because what is depicted in art does not necessarily reflect what exists physically. The condition of the remains also plays a role, because preservation can distort, drying processes, environmental factors. All of these can change how features appear, creating shapes that may not reflect the original form, and that possibility must be considered. But the consistency of the descriptions suggests that something about these remains stood out enough to be noted repeatedly, and that keeps the subject active. The layout of the tomb suggests intentional placement, bodies arranged, positioned, indicating that whatever the nature of the remains, they were treated as part of a structured burial process, and that structure reflects purpose, because it shows that this was not random. The absence of complete documentation adds to the uncertainty, because without full records, interpretation relies on fragments, descriptions, partial evidence, and that leaves gaps that are filled with possibilities. Some interpretations lean towards symbolic explanation, that the remains may have been altered or presented in a way that reflects belief rather than biology. Others consider natural processes that could create unusual appearances, but no single explanation fully closes the gap, and that is where the mystery remains. The idea of something that appears human, but not entirely, creates tension, because it challenges expectation, because it sits between categories, and that in-between space is difficult to define. The environment of the tomb contributes to preservation. Dry conditions, stable surroundings, allowing remains to retain form over long periods, but also influencing how that form changes, and that influence adds complexity. because it means that what is seen now may not match what was originally present. Even so, the descriptions persist. The idea of bird-like features, the suggestion of something different. And that persistence keeps the question open, because it shows that the observation was strong enough to remain part of the discussion. The lack of clear resolution is what defines this case, because there is no single answer that fully explains every aspect. Only possibilities, only interpretations, and that creates a space where the subject continues to exist, not fully understood, not fully dismissed, and maybe that is what makes the Tomb of the Birdmen stand out. Not because it proves something unusual, but because it presents something that does not fully fit. A case where appearance, context, and interpretation do not align perfectly. A tomb, with familiar structure, but unfamiliar details, and that difference is what remains. The pyramid that doesn't match the others, the third pyramid anomaly. 3 pyramids aligned on a plateau, rising from the desert, each one built with the same basic form, each one belonging to the same idea, the same purpose. And from a distance, they seem identical. But the closer you look, the more differences begin to appear, and those differences are where the questions begin. This is often referred to as the anomaly of the third pyramid, and what makes it stand out is not just its presence, but how it compares to the others, because while it shares the same overall shape, its scale, materials, and certain structural choices set it apart in ways that are not fully explained. And that contrast changes everything. The third pyramid is smaller, noticeably smaller than the others beside it, and that immediately raises a question, because if these structures were built as part of a sequence, following a similar purpose, why would one differ so significantly in size? And that question does not have a single clear answer. The outer casing of the pyramid also shows variation, because while the larger pyramids are associated with lighter stone, the third pyramid includes darker materials in parts of its exterior, creating a contrast that is visible even after erosion. And that choice is not random, because material selection affects both appearance and durability, and that suggests intention. The base structure is consistent with pyramid design, but the upper sections appear less complete, as if the structure was altered, changed, or left in a different state compared to the others. And that introduces another layer, because it suggests that the construction process may not have followed the same path. The surrounding area also differs slightly, because the arrangement of smaller structures, pathways, and related elements does not mirror the layout seen near the other pyramids exactly. And that variation reflects difference, because it shows that the site is not uniform. The interior structure adds more questions, because the internal chambers, passages, and layout differ in ways that suggest a different approach, possibly a different set of priorities during construction. And that difference reflects planning, because it shows that the design was not simply copied. The timeline associated with the pyramid is also part of the discussion, because it is often linked to a later period within the same general era, suggesting that changes in design, resources, or intention could have influenced how it was built, and that context matters, because it provides possible explanations, but not complete ones. The idea of resource availability is often considered, because building a structure of this scale requires materials, labour, coordination, and any change in these factors could influence the final result, and that possibility adds another angle, because it connects physical differences to practical limitations. But even with that, some aspects remain unclear, because the differences are not only about size, they extend into design, into material, into layout, and that combination is harder to explain with a single factor. The alignment of the pyramids also contributes to the discussion, because despite their differences, they still form a group, a set, indicating that they are connected. And that connection raises another question, because it suggests that the differences were made within a shared framework. The erosion over time has changed the appearance of all 3 pyramids, but the underlying differences remain visible, indicating that these variations were part of the original design rather than the result of later damage, and that persistence matters, because it shows that the anomaly is not recent. It is built into the structure. The idea of the third pyramid being different does not mean it is separate. It remains part of the same system, but it introduces variation within that system, and that variation is what creates uncertainty, because it shows that the pattern is not fixed. Even now, the pyramid stands, smaller, distinct, still aligned with the others, but clearly not identical, and that visible difference keeps the discussion active, because it invites comparison. The contrast between similarity and difference is what defines this structure, because it belongs, but does not fully match, and that tension creates interest, because it suggests that there were factors influencing its construction that are not fully preserved. And maybe that is what makes the third pyramid stand out, not because it is completely different, but because it is just different enough, a variation within a system that otherwise appears consistent, a structure that fits, but not perfectly, and that slight difference is what remains. The precision holes cut into solid stone, the inexplicable drill holes of Giza. At first they don't seem important. Small circular marks, holes cut into stone surfaces, sometimes shallow, sometimes deeper, often overlooked compared to the scale of the pyramids and the structures around them. But the closer you look, the more unusual they become, because these are not random marks, they are precise. This is what is often referred to as the drill holes of Giza. And what makes them stand out is not just their presence, but how they were made, because the holes appear clean, circular, and in some cases show patterns that suggest controlled cutting into very hard stone. And that detail changes everything. The stone itself matters, because many of these holes are found in materials like granite, a rock known for its hardness, requiring significant effort to shape or cut. And that raises the first question. How are these holes made? The shape of the holes is consistent, circular, smooth in many cases, with sides that suggest a controlled motion rather than random impact, indicating that a rotational process may have been used. And that implication is important, because it suggests technique. Some holes show what appear to be internal markings, lines, grooves, patterns that spiral or move downward along the interior surface, suggesting that the tool used moved in a consistent, repeating motion. And that observation adds another layer, because it indicates control over movement. The depth of some holes is also notable, because they extend into the stone in a way that suggests sustained cutting rather than surface marking, and that requires time, effort, consistency. The spacing between holes in certain areas also appears intentional, because they are not randomly placed, but positioned in ways that suggest planning, possibly related to construction, alignment, or structural processes. And that positioning reflects purpose, because it shows that the holes were not accidental. The idea of drilling into stone is not impossible, but the method used matters, because creating clean, circular holes in hard material requires tools that can maintain shape under pressure. And that leads to discussion, because the exact tools used are not always clearly identified in every case. Some interpretations suggest that basic tools, combined with abrasives, could achieve this effect over time, and that is supported by experimental approaches. But other observations focus on the apparent efficiency, the smoothness, the consistency, suggesting a level of control that raises further questions. And that difference in interpretation is where the discussion continues. The angle of certain holes also adds complexity, because they are not always perfectly vertical. Some are positioned at angles, indicating that the process could be adjusted based on need, showing flexibility in technique, and that flexibility reflects understanding, because it shows that the method was not fixed. The presence of these holes across different structures suggests that this was not an isolated practice, but part of a broader method used in multiple contexts, and that repetition reflects consistency, because it shows that the technique was known and applied. The surrounding surfaces sometimes show additional marks, signs of shaping, cutting, indicating that the holes were part of a larger process rather than standalone features. And that connection adds depth, because it places them within a system. The question is not just how the holes were made, but why, because their function is not always obvious. Some may relate to construction techniques, anchoring, alignment. Others may have served different purposes depending on context, but no single explanation applies to all cases, and that leaves room for interpretation. The condition of the holes today reflects both their original form and the effects of time, erosion, damage, but enough detail remains to observe their characteristics, and that persistence allows them to be studied. The contrast between simplicity and complexity is what defines this subject, because a hole seems simple, but the process behind it may not be, and that difference creates curiosity. Even now, these holes remain visible, embedded in stone, part of structures that have survived for thousands of years, and that visibility keeps the discussion active, because they can still be examined, compared, analysed. The balance between explanation and uncertainty is what defines this topic, because while there are possible methods, not every detail is fully agreed upon, and that creates a space where the subject remains open, not fully resolved, not fully unexplained. And maybe that is what makes the drill holes of Giza stand out, not because they are impossible, but because they sit at the edge of understanding, where technique, material and observation meet, but do not fully align into a single clear explanation. Small marks, cut into hard stone, precise, repeated, and still discussed, and that precision is what remains. The labyrinth that was said to be greater than the pyramids, Hawara Labyrinth. A structure described as so vast, so complex, that even those who saw it struggled to explain its full scale. A place said to contain countless rooms, passages, and spaces arranged in a way that was difficult to navigate and even harder to fully understand. And that kind of description is easy to dismiss, until you look closer. Because this is not just a story, it is tied to a real location. This is the Labyrinth of Hawara. And what makes it stand out is not just the idea of it, but the accounts associated with it, because descriptions from the past suggest a structure so large and intricate that it was considered more impressive than the pyramids themselves, and that comparison changes everything. The site at Hawara is known, located near the remains of a pyramid, indicating that the area was already significant, already part of a larger system of construction and activity, and that connection is important, because it places the labyrinth within a context, not isolated, but integrated. The descriptions of the labyrinth focus on complexity, multiple levels, numerous chambers, passages that connect in ways that are not immediately clear, creating a layout that is difficult to map or navigate. And that complexity reflects design, because it suggests that the structure was intentionally intricate. The idea of a labyrinth is not just about size, it is about movement, about how space is experienced, and that means that the layout was likely planned to guide or restrict movement in specific ways, and that control is important, because it defines function. The purpose of such a structure is not fully agreed upon. Some interpretations suggest administrative use, others consider ceremonial or symbolic roles, but no single explanation fully accounts for the scale described, and that uncertainty adds depth, because it shows that the function is not clearly preserved. The accounts describing the labyrinth emphasize its construction: stone, precision, large-scale building that required coordination, labour, and planning over extended periods, and that effort reflects organisation, because it shows that the project was sustained. The idea that it could surpass the pyramids in complexity is significant, because the pyramids themselves are already associated with large-scale construction, and to compare something to them in that way suggests that the labyrinth was not simple, but expansive. The physical remains today are limited, because much of the structure is no longer visible in its described form, leading to reliance on historical accounts and partial evidence, and that gap creates uncertainty, because without the full structure present, interpretation depends on fragments. The environment plays a role in that disappearance, because structures can degrade, be repurposed, covered, leaving only traces, and that process can reduce something large into something difficult to fully reconstruct. The connection between the labyrinth and the pyramid at Hawara suggests a relationship, because both exist within the same area, indicating that they may have been part of a larger system serving related functions, and that relationship adds complexity, because it shows that the site was not singular. The idea of a structure with numerous chambers also suggests storage, organisation, separation of spaces for different uses, but again, without full evidence, these remain possibilities. The persistence of the accounts is what keeps the labyrinth relevant, because despite the lack of complete physical remains, the descriptions continue to be referenced, discussed, analysed, and that persistence reflects impact, because it shows that the structure left a strong impression. The contrast between description and current evidence is what defines this subject, because what is described is extensive, but what remains is limited, and that difference creates tension, because it leaves space between what was and what is. Even now, the site at Hawara continues to be studied, examined for clues, for indications of what may still lie beneath or around the visible remains, and that ongoing investigation keeps the subject active, because it is not fully resolved. The idea of a lost structure of this scale challenges expectation, because it suggests that something significant can exist, be documented, and still not be fully preserved in a visible form, and that possibility expands understanding. And maybe that is what makes the Hawara Labyrinth stand out, not just because of what it was described to be, but because of what is no longer clearly visible, a structure that exists partly in record, partly in remains, and partly in the space between them. A network of rooms, a system of passages, once vast, now uncertain, and that absence is what remains. The subtle magnetic anomalies around Dahshur magnetic field, a quiet desert landscape, pyramids rising from flat ground, stone structures that appear still, unchanged and silent. Everything looks exactly as expected, but beneath that stillness, there are patterns that aren't immediately visible, because this is not just a place of structures, it is a place of measurements. This is Dahshur. And what makes it stand out is not just what can be seen, but what can be detected, because studies and observations in the area have suggested subtle variations in magnetic readings, changes that are not always consistent with the surrounding environment. And that introduces a different kind of mystery, because this is not visual, it is measurable. The idea of a magnetic field anomaly does not mean something extreme. It does not imply a strong force that can be felt directly. Instead, it refers to slight variations, differences in readings when instruments are used to detect magnetic intensity, and those differences can have multiple causes. The materials used in construction play a role, because stone can contain minerals that respond to magnetic fields, creating variations depending on composition. And that connection is important, because it links structure to measurement. The pyramids at Dahshur are built using large quantities of stone, different types, different densities, and that variation in material can influence how magnetic fields behave in the area. And that influence creates patterns. The arrangement of the structures also matters, because large masses can alter local readings, affecting how instruments respond, creating shifts that are not present in open terrain, and that effect reflects scale. Because the larger the structure, the greater the potential impact. The ground itself contributes as well. Because soil composition, underlying rock layers, and natural formations can create variations in magnetic readings, independent of human construction. And that adds complexity, because it means that multiple factors are interacting. The measurements taken in the area are not always uniform, because different locations produce slightly different results, suggesting that the field is not evenly distributed. And that variation is what defines the anomaly, because it shows that the environment is not consistent. The interpretation of these variations depends on perspective, because while some see them as natural results of material and structure, others consider whether the placement of the pyramids could have interacted with these fields in a way that was intentional. And that question remains open, because intention is difficult to prove. The concept of aligning structures with natural forces is not unique, because throughout history, locations have been chosen based on environmental factors. But connecting that idea directly to magnetic fields requires evidence that is not fully established, and that creates a space between observation and interpretation. The instruments used to detect these variations provide data, numbers, readings, but translating those readings into meaning requires context, and that context is not always complete, because it depends on comparison, on understanding what is typical for the area and what is not. The changes observed are subtle, not dramatic, which makes them more difficult to interpret, because small differences can result from many factors, and isolating a single cause is not simple. Even so, the presence of measurable variation keeps the topic active, because it shows that the environment is not uniform, that something is influencing the readings, and that influence invites investigation. The connection between structure and field remains part of the discussion, because while natural explanations exist, the proximity of the pyramids to these variations raises questions about whether their presence contributes in ways that are not fully understood, and that uncertainty keeps the subject open. The desert itself, often seen as empty, is not without complexity, because beneath the surface there are layers, materials and formations that interact with physical forces in ways that are not immediately visible, and that hidden complexity adds depth. Even now, Dahshur remains quiet, the pyramid standing, the landscape unchanged at first glance, but the measurements continue to suggest that there is more happening beneath the surface, subtle, unseen, but present. The contrast between what is visible and what is measurable is what defines this subject. Because while the structures appear still, the environment around them contains variation, and that difference creates curiosity, because it suggests that not everything about these places can be understood through sight alone. And maybe that is what makes the Dahshur magnetic field stand out, not because it is extreme, but because it is subtle, a reminder that even in places that appear simple, there can be layers of complexity that require different ways of observation. A quiet landscape, ancient structures, and beneath them, small variations, measured, but not fully explained, and that subtle difference is what remains. The pyramid where the walls began to speak, Pyramid of Unas. Compared to larger pyramids, it appears smaller, less imposing, its outer structure worn down over time, its original smooth surface no longer visible, leaving behind a form that feels reduced, almost overlooked. But the real difference is not outside, it's inside. This is the Pyramid of Unas, and what makes it stand out is not its size, but what was discovered within it, because inside these walls are some of the earliest known inscriptions carved directly into a pyramid, texts that transform the structure from a physical space into something more complex. And that changes everything. The entrance leads downward, a passage that moves into the interior, guiding movement from the outside world into a controlled, enclosed environment, where light fades and space becomes more defined. And that transition is intentional, because it separates two different conditions. The interior chambers are structured. Corridors, rooms, spaces that are not random but arranged in a sequence, guiding movement through the pyramid in a specific order, and that sequence reflects planning. Because it shows that the design was intentional, the walls inside are covered, not with decoration in the usual sense, but with inscriptions, carved symbols that form continuous lines across surfaces, creating a visual pattern that is also a form of communication. And that combination is important, because it merges structure with meaning. The inscriptions are consistent. Repeating symbols arranged in organized rows, indicating that the carving followed a system, a method that ensured alignment and readability. And that consistency reflects control, because it shows that the process was structured. The presence of these inscriptions marks a shift, because earlier pyramids are not known for this level of internal text, suggesting that something changed, that the role of the pyramid expanded beyond physical construction, and that shift adds depth, because it shows evolution. The content of the inscriptions is not immediately clear from observation alone, because they are part of a system of writing that requires interpretation, and that interpretation connects them to ideas, concepts, meanings that extend beyond the physical structure, and that connection transforms the space, because it becomes more than architecture, it becomes a medium. The process of carving these inscriptions into stone requires precision, because each symbol must be formed accurately, maintaining consistency across surfaces, indicating that the work was done with care and attention, and that precision reflects skill. The placement of the inscriptions also matters, because they are not randomly distributed but positioned in ways that align with the structure of the chambers, suggesting that their location is part of their function. And that alignment reflects intention, because it shows that the design includes both form and meaning. The pyramid itself, while smaller, still follows the structural principles of pyramid construction. A stable base, gradual incline, a form that distributes weight effectively, and that continuity connects it to other pyramids, but the interior distinguishes it. The experience of moving through the pyramid is defined by the inscriptions, because as you pass through the corridors, the walls are not empty, they are filled, creating a sense that the space is active, that it contains more than structure, and that presence changes perception. The condition of the pyramid today reflects time, erosion, damage, but the interior inscriptions remain visible, preserved enough to be studied, allowing the structure to still communicate what was placed within it. And that preservation is significant, because it maintains the connection between structure and text. The introduction of inscriptions into the pyramid marks a transition, because it shows that architecture began to include elements that extend beyond physical function, integrating representation, communication, and structure. And that integration adds complexity, because it expands the role of the building. Even now, the Pyramid of Unas remains, its outer form reduced, but its interior still intact enough to reveal its defining feature, allowing it to be experienced not just as a structure, but as a space filled with meaning, and that persistence keeps it relevant. The contrast between external simplicity and internal complexity is what defines this pyramid, because from the outside it appears modest, but inside it reveals something more, and that contrast changes understanding, and maybe that is what makes the Pyramid of Unas stand out, not because of its size, but because of what it contains, a structure where the walls themselves carry information, transforming the pyramid into something that holds both form and meaning, stone, corridors, covered in symbols, arranged with precision, and that shift is what remains. A sunken stone platform beneath the temple, the Osireion submerged structure. At first, it doesn't look like part of the temple. The structures above are more visible, walls, columns, open spaces shaped by design. But below that, there is something different, something lower, partially hidden, and often filled with water. This is what is known as the Osireion, and what makes it stand out is not just its position beneath the surrounding structures, but the way it is built, because unlike the lighter materials used above, this part is constructed from massive stone blocks, placed with a precision that feels separate from what surrounds it. And that contrast changes everything. The structure sits lower than the main temple level, reached by descending steps, moving from light into shadow, from open space into something more enclosed, more contained. And that descent is important, because it creates separation. The walls are made from large stone blocks, heavy, carefully shaped, fitted together with minimal gaps, creating surfaces that feel solid, stable, and deliberate, and that construction reflects control. Because working with blocks of that size requires planning. The layout is simple in form, rectangular, defined by straight lines and right angles, creating a space that feels structured, almost geometric in its clarity. And that simplicity adds to its impact, because it contrasts with the more complex forms above. The presence of water is one of the defining features, because the lower sections of the structure often contain water, creating reflections, altering the atmosphere, changing how the space is experienced. And that element introduces another layer, because water interacts with stone in ways that affect both appearance and preservation. The origin of the water is part of the discussion, because it may be connected to groundwater levels, natural seepage, or environmental conditions rather than intentional design, and that distinction matters, because it separates original function from current state. The placement of the Osireion beneath the temple suggests a relationship, because it is not separate, it exists as part of the same site. But its construction style raises questions, because the methods appear different, and that difference creates contrast. The scale of the stone blocks is notable, because moving and positioning such large pieces requires coordination, technique, and effort. And that effort reflects capability, because it shows that the builders could work at that scale. The interior space is open, defined by columns that support the structure above, creating a grid-like arrangement that divides the space without closing it. And that arrangement reflects order, because it shows that the design follows a system. The surface of the stone is smoother than what might be expected from natural formation, indicating that the blocks were shaped intentionally, creating flat planes that align with each other, and that precision reflects skill. The function of the structure is not fully defined, because while it is clearly part of the site, whether it served a symbolic, functional, or combined role is still discussed, and that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves room for interpretation. The difference in construction between the Osireion and the surrounding temple structures has led to various perspectives. Some focus on variation in technique, others consider differences in time, but no single explanation fully resolves every detail, and that keeps the subject open. The environment within the structure is distinct, cooler, darker, more contained, creating a space that feels separate from the outside, even though it is connected. And that separation affects perception, because it changes how the structure is experienced. Even now, the Osireion remains, partially submerged, its stone blocks still aligned, its form still visible, allowing it to be studied, observed, entered. And that persistence reflects durability, because the construction has withstood time and environmental change. The contrast between what is above and what is below is what defines this site, because the temple above is more visible, more detailed in surface design, while the structure below is more minimal, more focused on form and mass. And that difference creates tension, because it suggests that the two parts may not fully align in purpose or method, and maybe that is what makes the Osireion stand out, not just because it exists beneath the temple, but because of how it differs, a structure that feels separate while still being connected, defined by massive stone, simple geometry, and the presence of water. A lower chamber, partially submerged, built with precision, and that contrast is what remains. The boats buried beside the pyramids, the solar bark pits, long rectangular cuts in the ground, covered, hidden, positioned beside structures that already draw attention away from them, easy to overlook, but once uncovered, they reveal something unexpected. Because these are not empty spaces, they were designed to hold something very specific. These are the solar bark pits, and what makes them stand out is not just their location beside the pyramids, but what was placed inside them, because within these pits were the remains of full-sized boats, carefully disassembled and buried, preserved beneath the surface for long periods of time. And that changes everything. The shape of the pits is deliberate, long, narrow, matching the proportions of a vessel, suggesting that the dimensions were planned to fit the object they were meant to contain. And that alignment reflects intention, because it shows that the pit and the object are connected. The placement of these pits near pyramids is not random, because they are positioned in relation to the larger structures, indicating that they were part of a broader design, integrated into the site rather than added later. And that integration adds meaning, because it shows that they were considered important. The boats themselves are not small, full-sized, constructed with precision, composed of multiple components that were taken apart before being placed into the pits, indicating that the process was controlled, organised, deliberate. And that process reflects planning, because it shows that the burial was intentional. The preservation of the boats is notable, because being sealed within the pits protected them from exposure, allowing materials that would normally degrade to remain intact for long periods. And that preservation reflects environment, because it shows how conditions can maintain structure. The idea of burying a boat raises questions, because a boat is designed for movement, for water. But here, it is placed underground, and that contrast creates curiosity, because it suggests a purpose beyond practical use. The term solar bark connects the boats to symbolic interpretation, because it implies association with movement across the sky, with cycles, with transitions, but that interpretation exists alongside the physical reality of the object, and that dual nature adds depth, because it connects material and meaning. The construction of the boats shows detail, wood-shaped and fitted together, components arranged to form a complete structure when assembled, indicating that the builders had a clear understanding of how the vessel functioned, and that understanding reflects skill. The decision to disassemble the boats before burial is also important, because it suggests that the process of placement was structured, that the components were arranged in a way that allowed them to fit within the confined space of the pit, and that arrangement reflects control, because it shows that the process was planned. The covering of the pits adds another layer, because sealing the space creates isolation, separating what is inside from the outside environment, preserving it while also hiding it. And that concealment reflects intention, because it shows that the contents were meant to remain protected. The number of such pits at certain sites suggests repetition, because this was not a single occurrence, but a practice that was applied more than once, indicating that the concept had significance. And that repetition reflects continuity, because it shows that the method was part of a system. The relationship between the boats and the pyramids is what defines the subject, because they exist together, connected in placement, suggesting that they are part of the same framework. and that connection raises questions about purpose, because it implies coordination. The physical evidence of the boats allows for reconstruction, because the components can be studied, arranged, understood as a complete structure, providing insight into how they were built, and that reconstruction adds clarity, because it shows that the vessels were functional in design. Even now the pits remain, the outline still visible, the location still defined, allowing the relationship between pit and structure to be observed, and that persistence keeps them relevant. The contrast between function and placement is what stands out most, because a boat belongs on water, but here it is placed in the ground, and that difference creates tension, because it suggests that the object's role extends beyond its practical function. And maybe that is what makes the solar bark pits stand out, not just because of what they contain, but because of how those contents are treated, objects designed for movement, carefully placed into stillness, preserved beneath the surface, a vessel, disassembled, buried, with intention, and that placement is what remains. The hidden passages beneath the temple, Dendera subterranean chambers, walls covered in carvings, columns rising in symmetry, open spaces that define the structure clearly, giving the impression that everything is visible, everything is understood. But beneath that surface, there is more, because not all of it is meant to be seen immediately. This is the temple complex at Dendera, and what makes it stand out is not just what rises above the ground, but what exists below it, because beneath the visible structure are hidden passages, narrow corridors, and enclosed chambers that are not part of the main path, spaces that require deliberate access, and that hidden design changes everything. The entrances to these lower sections are not obvious, often concealed, placed in positions that do not draw attention, suggesting that access was controlled, limited to specific individuals or purposes, and that control is important, because it defines how the space is used. The passages themselves are narrow, confined, forcing movement to slow down, creating a transition from open space to something more restricted, more focused. And that shift affects perception, because it changes how the structure is experienced. The ceilings are low in many areas, reducing vertical space, creating an environment that feels enclosed, directing attention forward rather than upward. And that design is intentional, because it shapes movement. The walls of these passages are not empty. They contain markings, carvings, details that suggest that even these hidden areas were considered important enough to be shaped and defined. And that detail reflects intention, because it shows that these spaces were not secondary. The layout of the underground sections is not immediately clear, because passages connect in ways that are not obvious from the surface, creating a network that is difficult to fully map without exploration. And that complexity adds depth, because it shows that the structure extends beyond what is visible. The temperature and air within these spaces differ from above, cooler, more stable, creating an environment that is separate from the outside, reinforcing the sense of isolation, and that separation is part of the design, because it defines the experience. The purpose of these passages is not fully defined, because while their existence is clear, their exact function is open to interpretation, whether for storage, restricted activity, or other roles. And that uncertainty adds to the mystery, because it leaves space for multiple possibilities. The relationship between the upper temple and the lower passages suggests integration, because the structure above is supported by what lies beneath, indicating that both levels are part of the same system. And that connection reflects planning, because it shows that the design includes multiple layers. The construction of these passages required precision, because carving or building enclosed spaces beneath a structure requires awareness of weight, support, and alignment. And that precision reflects understanding, because it shows that the builders managed structural balance. The limited access points suggest control over who could enter these spaces, because not all areas are easily reachable, indicating that the use of these passages was likely restricted. And that restriction adds significance, because it shows that access was intentional. The preservation of these underground sections allows them to still be explored, because they remain intact enough to be entered, observed, and studied, providing direct evidence of their existence, and that persistence keeps them relevant. The contrast between visible and hidden is what defines this site, because what is seen above is only part of the structure, and what lies beneath adds another layer, and that layering changes understanding, because it shows that the temple is not just a surface structure, it extends below. The experience of moving from open, illuminated space into narrow, enclosed passages creates a transition that is both physical and perceptual, and that transition is part of the design, because it shapes how the structure is understood. Even now the passages remain, hidden, partially concealed, but accessible enough to reveal their presence, and that presence continues to raise questions, because while they are visible, they are not fully explained. And maybe that is what makes the hidden passages beneath Dendera stand out, not just because they exist, but because of how they are placed, a layer beneath a layer, a system within a system, extending the structure beyond what is immediately visible, narrow corridors and closed spaces hidden beneath stone, the structure beside the Sphinx that doesn't fully fit, the Sphinx Temple enigma. A structure positioned near the Sphinx, built from massive stone blocks, aligned with the surrounding monuments, appearing to belong to the same architectural system, and from a distance, it does, but the closer you look, the more differences begin to appear, and those differences are where the questions begin. This is often referred to as the Sphinx Temple, and what makes it stand out is not just its location, but how it is built, because the materials, construction style and layout suggest something that does not perfectly align with what is seen in nearby structures. And that contrast changes everything. The stone blocks used in the temple are large, extremely large, placed with precision, fitted together to form walls that feel solid, stable and intentional, indicating that the construction required significant effort and coordination. And that scale reflects capability, because moving and placing stones of that size is not simple. The surfaces of the blocks show minimal gaps, carefully aligned, creating a structure that relies on weight and placement rather than binding material, similar to other large stone constructions in the area. And that method reflects understanding, because it shows knowledge of structural balance. The layout of the temple is geometric, rectangular spaces, open courtyards, columns arranged in patterns that define movement, suggesting that the structure was designed with a specific flow in mind. And that flow reflects planning, because it shows that the space was organised. The relationship between the temple and the Sphinx is direct, because they exist within the same area, connected spatially, indicating that they are part of a broader system. And that connection raises questions, because it suggests coordination. The stone used in the temple appears different in some respects from surrounding structures, because the blocks have characteristics that suggest they may have been sourced or processed in a way that differs from nearby constructions, and that difference adds complexity, because it suggests variation in method. The erosion patterns on the temple also contribute to the discussion, because the surfaces show wear that is not identical to nearby structures, indicating that environmental factors may have affected them differently, or that the timing of construction differs. And that observation adds another layer, because it introduces the possibility of variation over time. The alignment of the temple within the site suggests intentional positioning, because it is not placed randomly but in relation to the Sphinx and other structures, indicating that its location was chosen deliberately. And that placement reflects design, because it shows that the site is organised. The function of the temple is not fully defined, because while it is clearly a constructed space, the exact activities that took place within it are not completely preserved, and that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves room for interpretation. The presence of columns within the structure suggests division of space, creating areas that are both open and defined, allowing movement while still organising the interior, and that organisation reflects purpose, because it shows that the space was structured. The scale of the temple is significant, because it is not a small addition, but a major structure within the complex, indicating that it held importance, and that importance reflects intention, because it shows that resources were allocated to its construction. The contrast between the temple and surrounding structures is subtle, because it does not appear completely different, but it is not identical, and that slight variation is what creates uncertainty, because it suggests that different factors may have influenced its construction. Even now, the temple remains, its walls still standing, its layout still visible, allowing it to be studied, compared, observed in relation to the Sphinx and other nearby structures, and that persistence keeps it relevant. The balance between similarity and difference is what defines this site, because it belongs to the same complex but does not fully match. And that tension creates curiosity, because it suggests that the structure may represent a variation within a system that is otherwise consistent. And maybe that is what makes the Sphinx Temple stand out. Not because it is separate, but because it is slightly different, a structure that fits within the larger design, but introduces elements that are not fully aligned with the rest. A temple of stone, positioned beside one of the most recognizable structures. Similar, but not identical, and that difference is what remains. The granite markings that don't fully explain themselves, Zayat el-Aryan granite code. A site that doesn't immediately present a finished structure, with sections that feel unfinished, surfaces that appear partially worked, and a layout that raises more questions than answers. But within that uncertainty, there are details that stand out, small, precise, difficult to ignore. This is the site of Zayat el-Aryan, and what makes it stand out is not just the structure itself, but certain markings found on granite surfaces, because these markings appear deliberate, organised, and yet not fully understood in their purpose or meaning. And that creates the mystery. The use of granite is significant, because granite is not an easy material to work with, requiring effort, technique, and time to shape, indicating that any markings made on it were intentional. And that intention matters, because it shows that these were not casual additions. The markings themselves vary. Lines, symbols, patterns that appear structured rather than random, suggesting that they were created with a specific purpose in mind. And that structure reflects planning, because it shows that the marks follow a system. The placement of these markings is also important, because they are not scattered randomly, but located in areas that suggest relevance to the structure itself, possibly connected to construction, alignment, or internal organisation. And that placement adds meaning, because it shows that the marks are part of a process. The term code is often used to describe them, but that term is interpretive, because it implies that the markings carry information, something that can be read or understood if the correct framework is applied. And that interpretation introduces complexity, because it suggests that there is meaning beyond the visible. However, not all markings are necessarily symbolic. Some may relate to construction processes, measurements, guides for placement, indicators used during building rather than messages intended to be preserved, and that possibility must be considered, because it connects the markings to practical function. The condition of the site affects interpretation, because incomplete structures leave gaps in understanding, making it difficult to connect markings to a fully realised design. And that uncertainty creates space for multiple explanations. The precision of the markings suggests control, because creating consistent lines or symbols on granite requires steady technique, indicating that the work was done carefully rather than quickly, and that care reflects intention, because it shows that the markings were important enough to execute properly. The location of the site within the broader region adds context, because it exists among other structures, suggesting that it is part of a larger system of construction and activity, and that connection raises questions about how it fits into that system. The absence of a complete structure makes the markings more prominent, because without a finished form to define the space, the smaller details become the focus, and that focus increases their significance. The interpretation of these markings depends on perspective, because without a clear key their meaning is not fixed. They can be seen as practical, symbolic, or a combination of both, and that flexibility keeps the subject open. Even now, the markings remain, carved into granite, resistant to change, allowing them to be observed directly, studied for patterns, compared across surfaces, and that persistence keeps them relevant. The contrast between clarity and uncertainty is what defines this site, because the markings are visible, but their meaning is not fully defined, and that difference creates curiosity, because it shows that not everything that can be seen can be immediately understood. The idea that these markings could represent a system, a method, or something more abstract continues to be discussed, because the evidence allows for interpretation, but not for a single conclusion, and that keeps the topic active. And maybe that is what makes the so-called granite code of Zayat el-Aryan stand out. not because it clearly reveals something hidden, but because it suggests that there is something to understand, a set of markings that appear intentional, structured, but not fully explained. Lines on stone, patterns without a clear key, placed with purpose, and that ambiguity is what remains. The massive stone boxes with impossible precision, the Serapeum of Saqqara. At first, it feels like an underground corridor, a long passage cut into the ground, quiet, enclosed, extending forward in a straight line, with side chambers opening at intervals, each one holding something that immediately draws attention. Because inside these chambers are massive stone boxes, and not just large, precise. This is the Serapeum, and what makes it stand out is not just the size of these boxes, but how they are made, because each one is carved from a single block of hard stone, with surfaces that appear flat, smooth, and aligned in a way that feels controlled beyond what would normally be expected. And that changes everything. The boxes are enormous, weighing far more than what can be easily moved, requiring coordination, planning, and technique to transport and position within the underground chambers, and that scale reflects capability, because it shows that the builders could operate at a level that involved managing extreme weight. The material used is often granite, dense, hard, difficult to shape, which means that creating flat surfaces and sharp edges requires time and consistent effort, and that effort reflects precision, because it shows that the work was controlled. The lids of the boxes fit tightly, aligned in a way that suggests careful measurement, because the edges meet without large gaps, creating a seal that appears deliberate. And that alignment is important, because it shows that the components were designed to match. The interior surfaces of some boxes appear smooth, consistent, suggesting that attention was given not only to the exterior but also to the inside, indicating that the structure was treated as a complete object. And that completeness adds complexity, because it shows that the design extends throughout. The placement of the boxes within the chambers is also deliberate, centered, positioned in a way that maximizes space while maintaining access, indicating that the layout of the corridor and chambers was planned around these objects. And that integration reflects organization, because it shows that the structure and the contents are connected. The process of creating these boxes would have required multiple stages: quarrying, shaping, transporting, positioning, each step requiring coordination, tools, and methods that maintain consistency across the entire process. And that sequence reflects planning, because it shows that the project was structured. The purpose of these boxes is not fully defined, because while they are often associated with burial or storage, the exact use of each box, the specifics of what they contained or represented, is not completely preserved. And that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves space for interpretation. The environment of the underground corridor contributes to preservation, because being enclosed protects the structures from weather, maintaining their condition over long periods, allowing details to remain visible. And that preservation reflects environment, because it shows how location influences survival. The repetition of these boxes across multiple chambers suggests a system, because this is not a single object, but many, indicating that the method was applied repeatedly, following a pattern. And that repetition reflects continuity, because it shows that the process was established. The precision of the surfaces raises questions, because achieving flatness and alignment in hard stone requires technique, and while methods exist, the consistency observed invites closer examination. And that observation adds another layer, because it focuses attention on process. The corridors themselves are structured, straight, defined, guiding movement through the space, creating a path that connects each chamber, allowing the boxes to be encountered in sequence. And that sequence reflects design, because it shows that the experience of the space was considered. Even now, the Serapeum remains, the boxes still in place, their surfaces still intact, allowing them to be observed directly, studied for detail, measured, compared, and that persistence keeps them relevant. The contrast between mass and precision is what defines these objects, because they are large, but also precise. And that combination creates impact, because it shows that scale does not limit accuracy. And maybe that is what makes the Serapeum boxes stand out, not just because of their size, but because of how they are made, objects that combine weight, material, and precision into something that feels controlled at every level. Massive stone forms, shaped with consistency, placed with intention, and that precision is what remains. The wooden object that resembles a flying machine, the Saqqara Bird. A small wooden object, lightweight, carved with a shape that is easy to overlook, something that could be mistaken for a toy, a model, or a decorative piece. Nothing about it immediately suggests significance, but the longer you look, the more unusual it becomes. Because this is not just a bird, this is what is known as the Saqqara Bird, and what makes it stand out is not just its form, but how that form compares to something much more modern, because its shape has been interpreted by some as resembling principles associated with flight. And that comparison changes everything. The object itself is small, compact, carved from wood, with a body that tapers toward the rear, creating a streamlined shape that feels intentional rather than random. And that shape is important, because it suggests design. The wings extend outward, flat, straight, positioned horizontally, creating a profile that differs from typical representations of birds, where wings are often curved or angled, and that difference draws attention, because it suggests variation. The absence of certain features also stands out, because while the object resembles a bird in some ways, it lacks details that would make it clearly identifiable as one, creating ambiguity in interpretation. And that ambiguity adds depth, because it leaves space for multiple perspectives. The tail section is one of the most discussed features, because it extends vertically rather than horizontally, creating a shape that is not typical for natural flight in birds, but resembles elements seen in modern aerodynamic designs. And that observation adds another layer, because it connects ancient object to modern concept. The surface of the object is smooth, shaped with care, indicating that it was carved deliberately with attention to proportion and balance. And that craftsmanship reflects intention, because it shows that the object was not accidental. The interpretation of the Saqqara Bird varies, because some view it as a symbolic representation, a stylized depiction of a bird or another form, consistent with artistic practices. Others consider whether its shape reflects an understanding of aerodynamic principles, and that difference in interpretation defines the subject, because it shows that the object can be understood in more than one way. The context in which it was found also matters, because it was discovered among other objects, suggesting that it was part of a collection, not an isolated item. And that connection adds meaning, because it places the object within a broader framework. The material, wood, is not permanent in the same way as stone, which makes the preservation of this object notable, because it has survived long enough to be studied, allowing its features to be examined directly. And that survival reflects conditions, because it shows that the environment allowed it to remain intact. The idea of flight is what draws attention, because it introduces a concept that feels out of place in the context of the time, creating a connection that is not immediately supported by other evidence. And that contrast creates curiosity, because it raises questions about interpretation. The shape alone does not confirm function, because resemblance does not equal purpose, and that distinction is important, because it separates observation from conclusion. The balance of the object suggests that it was designed to maintain stability in some form, whether for display, symbolic use, or another function. And that balance reflects understanding, because it shows that proportion was considered. The absence of moving parts or additional features limits certain interpretations, because without mechanisms the object remains static, reducing the likelihood of practical function related to movement. And that limitation adds clarity, because it narrows possibilities. Even so, the resemblance remains. The shape, the proportions, the features that align with concepts of lift and form, keeping the discussion active, because it shows that the object occupies a space between representation and resemblance. Even now, the Saqqara Bird remains, preserved, studied, displayed, allowing its form to be examined, compared, interpreted, and that persistence keeps it relevant. The contrast between simplicity and implication is what defines this object, because it is small, but the ideas connected to it are larger, and that difference creates interest, because it shows how a simple object can lead to complex interpretation. And maybe that is what makes the Saqqara Bird stand out, not because it proves something unexpected, but because it suggests something an object that resembles more than it confirms, leaving space between what it is and what it appears to be. A carved piece of wood, shaped with intention, resembling something familiar, but not fully explained, and that resemblance. The stone object with a shape that doesn't fully fit, the Schist Disk of Saqqara. At first it looks fragile, a carved stone object with thin edges, curved forms, and a structure that feels delicate compared to the massive stone constructions found around it. It doesn't immediately carry the weight or scale of monuments, but the more you look, the more unusual it becomes, because this is not a simple object. This is the Schist Disk of Saqqara, and what makes it stand out is not just its form, but how that form is executed, because it is carved from schist, a material that can split and fracture easily, shaped into a design that includes thin, extended sections and smooth curves that require careful handling, and that changes everything. The overall shape is circular, a central hub with extensions that radiate outward, forming a structure that resembles a disc with internal divisions, creating a pattern that is not purely decorative, and that pattern reflects design, because it shows that the shape was intentional. The thinness of the outer edges is one of the most notable features, because maintaining such thin sections in a material that can break easily requires precision, suggesting that the carving process was controlled and careful, and that precision reflects skill, because it shows that the maker understood the limits of the material. The symmetry of the object is also important, because the extensions are evenly spaced, creating balance, indicating that the proportions were planned rather than random. And that balance reflects intention, because it shows that the design follows a system. The surface of the disc is smooth, refined, indicating that it was finished with attention to detail, not left rough, suggesting that the final form mattered, and that refinement adds complexity, because it shows that the object was not purely functional in shaping, but also in presentation. The central opening suggests placement, because it implies that the object may have been mounted, fitted, or connected to something, indicating that it was not necessarily meant to exist alone. And that possibility adds another layer, because it introduces context. The interpretation of the disc varies, because its form does not clearly match common objects, leading to different perspectives on its purpose, whether practical, symbolic, or something else. And that variation defines the subject, because it shows that the object does not fit easily into a single category. The material itself plays a key role, because schist is workable, but not forgiving, requiring careful pressure during carving, meaning that creating such a shape without breakage involves control, and that control reflects technique. The presence of curved, flowing lines contrasts with the rigid, geometric forms seen in many other objects, creating a sense that this design follows a different approach, and that contrast adds uniqueness, because it sets the object apart. The condition of the disc today shows damage, breaks, missing sections, but enough remains to understand its original form, allowing its structure to still be analysed, and that preservation is important, because it maintains the basis for interpretation. The idea that the disc could represent something functional is considered, because the shape suggests movement or flow in some interpretations, but without clear evidence, these remain possibilities rather than conclusions, and that uncertainty keeps the subject open. The scale of the object is relatively small compared to architectural structures, but its complexity gives it significance beyond size, because it shows that detailed work was applied even at smaller scales, and that detail reflects importance. The lack of similar objects adds to the mystery, because without multiple examples, comparison is limited, making it harder to place the disc within a broader pattern, and that isolation increases uncertainty. Even now, the schist disk remains, preserved in its current form, studied, examined, allowing its shape and features to be observed directly, and that persistence keeps it relevant. The contrast between material and design is what defines this object, because a fragile material is shaped into a complex form, and that combination creates tension, because it suggests that the maker worked at the edge of what the material allows, and maybe that is what makes the schist disk stand out, not because it clearly reveals its purpose, but because it presents a form that does not fully match expectations, an object shaped with precision, balance, and care, but without a clear explanation of why. A circular design, thin and controlled, carved from fragile stone, and that form The pillar, with a meaning that isn't fully clear, the Djed pillar mystery. A vertical form carved in stone, rising upward with a series of horizontal lines near the top, a shape that repeats across different sites, appearing in carvings, reliefs and objects consistent enough to be recognizable. But the more you see it, the more questions it raises. Because this is not just a decorative element. This is the Djed pillar, and what makes it stand out is not just its repeated appearance, but the fact that its meaning, while often interpreted, is not fully fixed, because it represents something that is both visual and symbolic at the same time, and that dual nature changes everything. The structure of the pillar is consistent: a base, a vertical shaft, and a top section marked by horizontal bands, creating a form that is distinct, easy to identify, suggesting that the design was intentional and standardized. And that consistency reflects importance because it shows that the symbol was recognized and repeated. The placement of the Djed pillar across different contexts adds complexity, because it appears in various locations, sometimes as a standalone element, sometimes integrated into larger scenes, indicating that it was not limited to a single function. And that variation reflects flexibility, because it shows that the symbol could be used in multiple ways. The interpretation of the pillar often connects it to stability, support, something that holds structure in place, whether physically or conceptually, and that interpretation aligns with its form, because the vertical shape suggests strength. But interpretation is not confirmation, and that distinction matters, because it shows that meaning is assigned, not always explicitly defined. The repeated use of the pillar suggests that it held significance over time, because symbols that persist are typically those that carry meaning within a system, and that persistence reflects continuity, because it shows that the idea remained relevant. The material in which the pillar is represented varies: stone, relief carvings, objects, indicating that the form was adaptable, not tied to a single medium, and that adaptability reflects importance, because it shows that the symbol could be expressed in different ways. The positioning of the pillar within scenes sometimes places it alongside figures or structures, suggesting that it is part of a larger composition, contributing to the overall meaning of the scene, and that integration adds depth, because it shows that the symbol interacts with other elements. The simplicity of the form contrasts with the complexity of its interpretation, because visually it is straightforward, but conceptually it carries layers of meaning that are not fully fixed, and that contrast creates curiosity, because it shows that simple forms can hold complex ideas. The repetition of the horizontal bands at the top creates a sheer pattern that is distinctive, possibly representing segmentation, layering or structure, though the exact interpretation varies, and that variation keeps the subject open, because it shows that there is no single agreed meaning. The presence of the pillar in different contexts suggests that it was not limited to a single moment or use, but part of a broader system of representation, and that system reflects organization, because it shows that symbols were integrated into communication. Even now, the Djed pillar remains visible in preserved structures, carvings, artifacts, allowing it to be studied, compared, recognized across different sites, and that persistence keeps it relevant. The contrast between form and meaning is what defines this symbol, because the form is fixed, but the meaning is flexible, and that difference creates space for interpretation, because it shows that not everything is defined in a single way. The idea that the pillar represents something foundational continues to be discussed, because its form suggests support, continuity, stability. But without a definitive explanation, these remain interpretations, and that keeps the mystery active. And maybe that is what makes the Djed pillar stand out. Not because it hides something unknown, but because it represents something that is not fully defined. A symbol that appears simple, repeated, structured, but open to interpretation. A vertical form, marked by layers, recognized across time. And that meaning, the quarry that supplied monuments, then fell silent, Gebel el-Silsila, rock formations rising along the river, cliffs shaped by erosion, surfaces that appear untouched, part of the environment rather than something shaped by human activity. But the closer you look, the more signs begin to appear. Straight cuts, flat surfaces, marks that don't follow natural patterns. And that's where the story changes. This is Gebel el-Silsila, And what makes it stand out is not just that it is a quarry, but the scale at which it was used, because this site provided massive quantities of stone for construction, material that would go on to form some of the most recognisable structures in the region. And that connection changes everything. The rock here is sandstone, layered, relatively easier to shape compared to harder materials, making it suitable for cutting into blocks that can be transported and used in construction. And that suitability reflects selection, because it shows that the location was chosen deliberately. The surfaces of the quarry walls reveal patterns, parallel lines, cut marks that indicate where blocks were extracted, showing that the rock was removed in controlled sections rather than randomly broken apart. And that control reflects technique, because it shows that the process was organised. The scale of extraction is significant, because large sections of rock were removed, leaving behind spaces that define the quarry, indicating sustained activity over time. And that scale reflects demand, because it shows that the material was needed in large quantities. The proximity to the river is important, because it allows for transport, providing a route for moving heavy stone blocks from the quarry to construction sites, reducing the need for overland movement. And that connection reflects planning, because it shows that logistics were considered. The evidence of unfinished blocks within the quarry adds another layer, because these pieces remain partially cut, still attached to the surrounding rock, suggesting that work was stopped before completion. And that interruption raises questions, because it indicates a moment where activity ceased. The layout of the quarry includes multiple working areas, sections where extraction took place, each with its own pattern of cuts, indicating that different teams or phases of work may have existed. And that organisation reflects structure, because it shows that the site was managed. The tools used to cut the stone would have left marks, indentations, lines that reveal the method of extraction, providing insight into how the material was shaped and separated, and that evidence connects process to result, because it shows how the blocks were produced. The sudden decline or cessation of activity at the quarry is not fully explained, because while the site clearly functioned at a high level, the reasons for its reduced use or abandonment are not entirely clear, and that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves space for interpretation. The absence of ongoing activity creates contrast, because a place that once produced material at scale now remains quiet, its surfaces still showing the marks of work that was never fully completed. And that stillness is noticeable, because it reflects change. The connection between the quarry and the structures built from its stone is indirect but significant, because while the quarry itself is not the final form, it is the source, the beginning of the process that leads to construction elsewhere. And that role adds importance, because it shows that the site is part of a larger system. The landscape itself has been altered by the extraction, because removing stone changes the form of the rock, creating spaces that did not exist naturally, leaving behind evidence of human activity embedded in the terrain. And that alteration reflects impact, because it shows that the environment was shaped. Even now, Gebel el-Silsila remains, the cut marks still visible, the unfinished block still present, allowing the process of extraction to be observed directly, providing a record of how material was taken and prepared. And that persistence keeps it relevant. The contrast between activity and stillness is what defines this site, because it was once active, and now it is not. And that difference creates curiosity, because it raises questions about change, why the activity stopped, why the site was left as it is. The idea of a quarry vanishing is not literal, because the site still exists, but its function has ended, its role in construction no longer active, and that shift changes perception, because it transforms the site from a place of production to a place of record. And maybe that is what makes Gebel el-Silsila stand out, not just because of what it produced, but because of what it shows, a site that reveals the beginning of construction, the extraction of material, the process behind the structures that followed, a landscape shaped by cutting, marked by intention, left in a state that reflects both activity and its absence. And that transition, the massive black boxes hidden beneath the ground, the underground granite boxes. At first, it feels like a simple underground space, a corridor, dimly lit, cut into stone, extending forward with a quiet stillness, the kind of place that doesn't immediately reveal its significance. But then, the chambers open, and inside them are objects that change everything. Massive black stone boxes, perfectly shaped, placed with intention, and that's where the questions begin. Because these are not rough containers, they are precise, extremely precise. These underground granite boxes are carved from single blocks of stone, dense material, heavy, difficult to shape, and yet their surfaces appear flat, smooth, and aligned in a way that feels controlled beyond what you would expect from something this large. And that contrast is what stands out. The scale is the first thing that becomes clear. Each box is enormous, too heavy to move casually, requiring planning, coordination, and a method of transport that had to account for both weight and balance. And that alone raises a question, because moving something of that size underground is not simple. The corridors that lead to these chambers are narrow compared to the size of the boxes, which means the placement had to be planned in advance, because once positioned, they are not easily moved, and that suggests sequence. Because the structure and the objects were designed together. The material itself is granite, hard, resistant, requiring sustained effort to shape, and yet the surfaces of these boxes are not rough. They are smooth, flat, edges meeting with a level of alignment that suggests careful measurement. And that precision is not just external. The interiors of some boxes show similar consistency. Flat walls, defined corners, indicating that the work was carried through the entire object, not just the visible surfaces. And that level of completeness adds another layer, because it shows that the process was thorough. The lids are separate pieces, massive in their own right, fitted onto the boxes with minimal gaps, creating a seal that appears deliberate, suggesting that the closure was part of the design, not an afterthought. And that alignment reflects control, because it shows that the components were made to match. The positioning of the boxes within the chambers is centered, balanced, not pushed against walls but placed in a way that defines the space around them. And that placement is important, because it suggests that the space exists for the object, not the other way around. The function of these boxes is not fully defined, because while they are often associated with burial or storage, the exact role of each box, what it contained, how it was used, is not completely preserved, and that uncertainty creates space for interpretation. Some explanations focus on practical function, storage, containment. Others consider symbolic roles, but no single explanation fully accounts for every detail, and that keeps the discussion open. The environment underground contributes to preservation. Stable, protected, allowing the surfaces of the boxes to remain intact over long periods, maintaining their form and detail, and that preservation allows observation, because the objects can still be studied directly. The contrast between mass and precision is what defines these boxes, because they are large, but also exact, and that combination creates tension, because it suggests that scale did not limit control. The effort required to produce these objects would have been significant. Quarrying the stone, shaping it, transporting it, positioning it, each step requiring coordination and consistency, and that effort reflects organization, because it shows that the process was structured. Even now the boxes remain, silent, unchanged, their surfaces still aligned, their placement still deliberate, allowing them to be observed, measured, questioned. And that persistence keeps them relevant. The difference between what is visible and what is understood is what defines this subject, because the boxes can be seen, their features can be described, but their full purpose is not completely clear. And that difference creates curiosity, because it shows that not everything is resolved, and maybe that is what makes these underground black boxes stand out, not just because of their size, but because of how they are made, objects that combine weight, precision, and placement in a way that feels controlled at every level. Massive forms, carved from stone, placed beneath the surface, and still not fully explained, and that precision. The erosion patterns that don't fully match the environment, the Sphinx water damage debate. The surface of the stone is uneven, worn down over time, marked by erosion that has softened edges, carved lines, and changed the original shape of the structure. And that seems expected, because any structure exposed for long enough will change, but the details don't fully align with that simple explanation, and that's where the discussion begins. This is often referred to as the Sphinx water erosion debate. And what makes it stand out is not just the presence of erosion, but the type of patterns visible on the surface, because some of these patterns appear vertical, rounded, and deeply cut in ways that are not always consistent with typical wind-driven erosion. And that difference changes everything. The Sphinx is carved directly from limestone, a material that responds to environmental conditions, meaning that over time, wind, sand, and moisture can all influence how its surface changes, and that interaction is important, because it determines how the structure evolves. The erosion patterns visible today vary across the structure. Some areas show horizontal wear, others show vertical channels, and that variation is where the discussion becomes more complex, because different types of erosion produce different patterns. Wind erosion tends to create sharper, more directional marks, often horizontal, driven by sand carried across the surface, and that effect is visible in many desert environments. But some of the marks on the Sphinx appear rounded, smoothed, with vertical flow patterns that resemble water runoff, and that observation introduces another possibility. Because water erosion behaves differently, rainfall can create vertical channels, softer curves, gradual shaping that follows gravity, and that type of pattern is what some focus on. The question then becomes, when would that kind of erosion have occurred? Because the current environment around the Sphinx is dry, with limited rainfall, meaning that significant water-based erosion would require different conditions, and that introduces time, because it suggests that the environment may not always have been the same. The interpretation of these patterns varies. Some see them as evidence of past conditions where water played a larger role. Others argue that variations in limestone layers, combined with wind and occasional moisture, can produce similar effects over long periods, and that difference in interpretation is central, because it shows that the same evidence can lead to different conclusions. The structure itself has undergone restoration and repair over time. Blocks added, sections reinforced, which means that not all visible surfaces are original, and that complicates analysis, because it introduces variables. The enclosure surrounding the Sphinx also shows erosion, walls that display similar patterns, extending the discussion beyond a single surface, and that extension adds weight, because it shows that the phenomenon is not isolated. The depth of some erosion marks suggests long-term exposure, because deeper cuts require sustained processes, and that duration is part of the analysis, because it relates to time. The alignment of the Sphinx within the landscape also matters, because its position affects how wind and water would interact with its surface, influencing erosion patterns, and that positioning adds context, because it shows that environment and structure are connected. The debate itself is ongoing, because there is no single interpretation that fully explains every detail without question, and that lack of resolution keeps the subject active, because it allows for continued analysis. The contrast between expectation and observation is what defines this topic, because what is expected in a desert environment does not always fully match what is observed on the structure, and that difference creates curiosity, because it suggests that there may be factors not immediately visible. Even now the Sphinx remains, its surface marked, its form altered by time, but still intact enough to show the patterns that continue to be studied, and that persistence keeps the discussion relevant. The balance between natural process and interpretation is what defines this subject, because erosion is real, visible, but its exact cause in every detail is not fully agreed upon, and that creates a space where the structure becomes more than just a monument. It becomes a subject of analysis, a surface that holds patterns, a record of interaction between material and environment, and maybe that is what makes the Sphinx erosion stand out. Not because it clearly proves one idea, but because it presents evidence that can be read in more than one way, a surface shaped by time, but not fully explained by a single process. Stone worn by forces, patterns left behind, visible but debated, and that uncertainty, the empty space inside the pyramid that shouldn't be there, the hidden void. A structure studied for generations, measured, explored, mapped in detail with known chambers, corridors, and internal spaces that define its layout. And for a long time, it felt understood. But then, something unexpected appeared. Not visible, not accessible, but detected. This is what is known as the hidden void inside the pyramid. And what makes it stand out is not just its presence, but how it was found, because it was not discovered through excavation or direct entry, but through scanning techniques that revealed a space where no space was expected. and that changes everything. The method used to detect this void relies on particles that pass through stone, measurements that track how these particles move, revealing differences in density within the structure, allowing unseen spaces to be identified without physically opening the pyramid. And that approach is important, because it shows that discovery is no longer limited to direct observation. The data indicated a region within the pyramid that differs from the surrounding material, a space, not solid, extending across a significant area. And that observation was consistent enough to be recognized as more than noise, and that consistency gives it weight, because it shows that the detection is not random. The location of the void is above known chambers, positioned in a way that does not immediately align with the existing layout, suggesting that it is not part of the already understood internal structure. And that placement raises questions, because it suggests something additional. The shape of the void is not fully defined, because without direct access, interpretation depends on data, which provides outlines, estimates, but not complete detail. And that limitation adds uncertainty, because it leaves room for multiple possibilities. One possibility is structural, that the void serves as a space to reduce weight, to relieve pressure within the pyramid, contributing to stability. And that explanation connects to engineering, but it does not fully resolve every question, because the size and placement still invite further analysis. Another possibility is that it represents an unfinished or unused space, a part of the structure that was created but never integrated into the main system, and that interpretation reflects process, because it suggests change during construction. The absence of direct access is what defines this discovery, because the void cannot currently be entered or visually confirmed in detail, meaning that all understanding comes from indirect observation, and that creates distance, because it separates detection from experience. The idea that there could still be unknown spaces inside such a well-studied structure is what makes this significant, because it challenges the assumption of completeness, and that challenge changes perspective. The precision of the pyramid's construction adds another layer, because the presence of an unknown space within a structure, known for its accuracy, suggests that there may be aspects of the design that are not fully understood, and that possibility adds depth. The technology used to detect the void represents a shift, because it allows ancient structures to be explored in new ways, revealing details that were previously inaccessible, and that shift expands understanding. But it also introduces new questions, because each discovery leads to more unknowns. Even now the void remains, undisturbed, unseen directly, existing as a detected space within solid stone, and that existence keeps the subject active, because it invites investigation. The contrast between visibility and detection is what defines this topic, because the space cannot be seen, but it is known to be there, and that difference creates curiosity, because it shows that absence of visibility does not mean absence of structure. The possibility that more unknown spaces could exist adds another layer, because it suggests that the pyramid may still contain elements that have not yet been identified, and that idea expands the scope of exploration. And maybe that is what makes the hidden void stand out, not because it has been fully explained, but because it represents something new within something ancient, a discovery that shows that even well-studied structures can still hold unknown elements, a space within stone, detected but not yet seen, and that unseen presence. The ruler who changed how power was shown, Hatshepsut. At first, the record feels incomplete. Names missing, images altered, references that appear in some places, but not in others, and that absence is where the story begins. Because when something is removed, it usually means it mattered. This is Hatshepsut, and what makes her stand out is not just that she ruled, but how she ruled, because she took a position that was not traditionally held by someone like her, and reshaped it in a way that allowed her authority to be recognized, maintained, and extended, and that changes everything. The role of a pharaoh was clearly defined, structured, associated with power, leadership, and representation, and those roles were typically consistent in how they were presented. But in this case, something shifts, because Hatshepsut did not simply take the role, she adapted it. The representations of her vary. In some cases, she appears in ways that align with traditional depictions of rulers. In others, the presentation changes, reflecting a balance between identity and authority. And that variation is important, because it shows that image was part of governance. The structures associated with her rule reflect organisation, planning, construction at scale, projects that required coordination, resources, and sustained effort. And that level of activity reflects control, because it shows that her position was not symbolic, it was active. The architecture linked to her period shows consistency, defined forms, structured layouts, indicating that construction followed systems that were already established but continued under her direction, and that continuity matters, because it shows that governance was stable. The absence of conflict in certain records suggests a period of relative stability, because large-scale projects require conditions that allow them to proceed without interruption, and that stability reflects management, because it shows that systems were maintained. The removal of her name and image in later periods adds another layer, because it suggests that her presence was altered after her time, indicating that how she was remembered changed, and that change raises questions, because it shows that legacy is not fixed. The reasons for this alteration are not fully defined, because while the evidence of removal exists, the exact motivation behind it is interpreted in different ways, and that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves space for analysis. The balance between visibility and absence is what defines her record, because she is present in what remains, but also in what was removed, and that contrast creates complexity, because it shows that history can be shaped after the fact. The structures that remain provide physical evidence, allowing her period to be studied through what was built, rather than only through written records, and that physical presence is important, because it anchors the narrative. The scale of construction during her rule suggests coordination, because organising labour, materials and design requires systems that function effectively, and that effectiveness reflects capability. The continuity of style during her time indicates that she did not disrupt existing systems, but worked within them, adapting rather than replacing. And that approach reflects strategy, because it shows that change was controlled. The perception of her role varies depending on interpretation, because without a complete record, understanding relies on combining what remains with what can be inferred, and that process creates multiple perspectives. Even now, her presence remains visible, through structures, through references, through the absence where something once existed, and that combination keeps the subject active. The contrast between authority and representation is what defines her story, because it shows how power can be expressed in different ways, how roles can be adapted while maintaining structure, and that adaptation creates impact, because it shows that systems are not always fixed, and maybe that is what makes Hatshepsut stand out, not just because she ruled, but because of how she did it, a figure who navigated a defined system, adjusted its presentation, and maintained authority within it. A presence recorded, partially removed, still visible, and that balance. The spaces behind the walls that may still exist. Tutankhamun's hidden chambers. At first it seemed complete. A tomb discovered, opened, documented in detail, its chambers mapped, its contents recorded, creating the impression that everything inside had already been found. Nothing hidden, nothing left. But over time, that certainty began to shift, because small details started to stand out. Subtle, easy to miss, but consistent enough to raise questions. This is the idea of hidden chambers within the tomb of Tutankhamun, and what makes it stand out is not just the possibility of additional spaces, but how that possibility emerged, because it wasn't based on excavation, but on observation, analysis of walls, surfaces, and patterns that suggested something might exist beyond what is visible. And that changes everything. The walls of the tomb are covered in decoration, painted surfaces that appear continuous, forming complete scenes, giving the impression that there is nothing behind them. But when examined closely, some areas show differences, lines that do not fully match the surrounding patterns, subtle variations in texture. And those differences are where the questions begin, because they suggest that the walls may not be solid throughout. The idea is that behind certain sections there could be sealed doorways, blocked passages, spaces that were closed off during construction or later, and that possibility introduces a new layer, because it suggests that the tomb may not be as simple as it appears. The use of scanning technology has added to this discussion. because tools that detect differences in material density can identify areas where the structure changes, suggesting voids or spaces beyond the surface. And those scans have produced results that are not entirely uniform. Some readings suggest anomalies, others are less conclusive, and that variation keeps the subject open, because it shows that the evidence is not definitive. The size of the tomb compared to expectations also contributes to the discussion, because it appears smaller than what might be expected for a figure of its significance, leading to the idea that additional space may exist beyond the visible chambers, and that comparison adds context, because it raises the question of completeness. The alignment of certain walls suggests that the structure may extend further, because the layout does not fully resolve in a way that feels final, indicating that there could be continuation beyond what is currently known, and that alignment adds another layer, because it supports the idea of hidden space. The possibility that the tomb was adapted from an earlier structure is also considered, because modifications could explain why certain areas appear sealed, suggesting that the current layout may not represent the original design. And that interpretation reflects process, because it shows that structures can change. The absence of direct access is what defines this mystery, because without opening the walls, the existence of hidden chambers cannot be fully confirmed, and that creates distance between observation and proof. The preservation of the tomb complicates decisions, because opening walls risks damaging what is already known, creating a balance between exploration and conservation, and that balance affects how the subject is approached. Even now, the possibility remains, the walls still standing, the surfaces still intact, with questions that have not been fully resolved, and that persistence keeps the discussion active. The contrast between visibility and possibility is what defines this topic, because what is seen appears complete, but what may exist behind it is not, and that difference creates curiosity, because it suggests that there could still be something undiscovered within a space that has already been explored. The idea that a hidden chamber could still exist within such a well-known tomb challenges expectation, because it shows that even the most studied places can hold unknown elements. And that possibility expands understanding, and maybe that is what makes the hidden chambers of Tutankhamun stand out. Not because they have been fully revealed, but because they might still be there, spaces concealed behind finished surfaces, part of a structure that appears complete, but may not be entirely so. A sealed wall, a possible passage, an unseen space, and that possibility, the method behind the structure that still raises questions, how the Great Pyramid was built. A structure rising from the ground with near-perfect alignment, massive stone blocks stacked with consistency, forming a shape that has remained intact for thousands of years. And the immediate question is simple: how was this built? Because the scale alone suggests difficulty, but the closer you look, the more layers appear, and that's where the real story begins. The Great Pyramid is made of millions of stone blocks, each one shaped, transported, and placed with a level of consistency that suggests planning, not improvisation. And that scale is the first challenge, because managing that many components requires organisation, not just effort. The stone itself comes from different sources, some blocks quarried locally, others transported from farther distances, indicating that the builders worked with multiple locations, coordinating extraction and delivery. And that coordination reflects system, because it shows that the process was not isolated. The shaping of the blocks is consistent, flat surfaces, defined edges, allowing them to fit together in a way that distributes weight evenly, and that precision is important, because it ensures stability. The transport of these blocks is one of the central questions, because moving heavy stone requires method. One widely accepted approach involves sliding the blocks over prepared surfaces, possibly using moisture to reduce friction, allowing movement across ground without lifting the full weight, and that method reflects efficiency, because it reduces resistance. The presence of pathways, or ramps, is another key part of the discussion, because lifting stone to higher levels requires elevation, and ramps provide a way to gradually move materials upward. These ramps could have been straight, curved, or built in sections, and each variation reflects a different approach to solving the same problem. The exact form of these ramps is still debated, because no complete structure remains, but the concept itself remains consistent. Gradual elevation, controlled movement, and that idea reflects logic, because it aligns with physical constraints. The placement of the blocks required coordination, because once a block reached its position, it had to be aligned with surrounding stones, creating a structure that maintains shape and balance. And that alignment reflects measurement, because it shows that placement was not random. The workforce required for such a project would have been organised, divided into groups, each with specific roles, from quarrying to transport to placement, and that organisation reflects management, because it shows that the process was structured. The timeline of construction is another factor, because building at this scale requires sustained effort over time, meaning that the process had to be maintained consistently, not just started. And that continuity reflects planning. The internal structure of the pyramid adds complexity, because it includes chambers and passages that had to be integrated during construction, requiring coordination between external building and internal design. And that integration reflects foresight, because it shows that the internal layout was planned from the beginning. The alignment of the pyramid with cardinal directions is precise, suggesting that orientation was considered during construction, requiring methods of measurement that allowed consistent positioning. And that precision reflects understanding, because it shows awareness of direction. The outer casing stones, now mostly absent, were once smooth, polished, creating a surface that reflected light, indicating that the final appearance was as important as the structure itself. And that finish reflects intention, because it shows that the project included both function and presentation. The absence of a single definitive method is what defines this topic, because multiple approaches can explain different aspects, but no single explanation accounts for every detail without question. And that keeps the discussion open, because it allows for layered understanding. The combination of simple techniques applied at scale is one of the strongest explanations, because complexity can emerge from repetition, from consistent application of methods over time. And that perspective reframes the problem, because it shifts focus from single solutions to systems. Even now, the pyramid remains stable, aligned, its structure still intact, allowing it to be studied, measured, analysed, and that persistence keeps it relevant. The contrast between simplicity and scale is what defines this structure. Because the methods may be straightforward, but the application is immense, and that combination creates impact, because it shows that large results can come from controlled processes, and maybe that is what makes the construction of the Great Pyramid stand out. Not because it requires a single extraordinary explanation, but because it represents the combination of planning, organisation, and sustained effort, applied consistently over time, stone-shaped and placed, layer by layer, system over scale, and that process, the tomb that was never found, Cleopatra's missing resting place. At first, it feels like something that should already be known, a figure this significant, a life this documented, a story this widely remembered. It would seem natural that the final resting place would be clearly identified, but it isn't. And that absence is where the mystery begins. This is the missing tomb of Cleopatra. And what makes it stand out is not just that it hasn't been found, but that despite centuries of searching, references and analysis, there is still no confirmed location that can be identified with certainty. And that changes everything. The historical accounts describe her final moments, a sequence of events that leads to her death, placing her within a defined timeline, suggesting that burial would have followed. And that expectation creates a question, because if a burial took place, where is it? The references to her tomb are limited, fragmented, providing hints rather than precise details, indicating that while the existence of a burial is acknowledged, its location was not clearly preserved. And that lack of clarity adds uncertainty, because it leaves space between record and reality. The environment in which she lived has changed, structures lost, land altered, urban development covering earlier layers, meaning that locations that once existed may now be hidden beneath later construction, and that transformation affects discovery, because it changes what can be accessed. Some theories suggest that her tomb may be located near known historical centres. Others consider the possibility that it lies beyond the most obvious areas, in locations that have not been fully explored, and that variation reflects interpretation, because it shows that the evidence does not point in a single direction. The possibility that the tomb was intentionally concealed is also considered, Because burial practices can involve protection, secrecy, measures designed to prevent disturbance, and that idea adds another layer, because it suggests that the absence may not be accidental. The materials used in burial structures can degrade over time. Stone remains, but other materials may not, meaning that even if a tomb existed, its visible elements may have changed or disappeared, and that affects identification. Because it reduces what can be observed, the search itself has evolved, from early attempts based on textual references to modern methods that include excavation, mapping, and analysis of terrain. And that evolution reflects progress, because it shows that methods change over time, but the result remains the same: no confirmed tomb, and that consistency keeps the mystery active, because it shows that even with improved methods, some discoveries remain out of reach. The connection between historical record and physical evidence is not always direct, because descriptions do not always lead to exact locations, especially when details are limited or altered over time, and that disconnect creates difficulty, because it separates narrative from place. The idea that the tomb could still exist, undiscovered, adds another dimension, because it suggests that the mystery is not resolved, only incomplete, and that possibility keeps attention focused. The absence of confirmation is what defines this subject, because without a verified site, all interpretations remain possibilities rather than conclusions, and that uncertainty creates space for continued exploration. Even now the search continues, new areas examined, new methods applied, but the result remains unchanged. The tomb has not been definitively found, and that persistence keeps the subject relevant. The contrast between historical importance and physical absence is what defines this mystery, because a figure of great significance does not have a confirmed resting place, and that difference creates impact, because it shows that not everything is preserved equally. And maybe that is what makes Cleopatra's missing tomb stand out, not just because it hasn't been found, but because it represents a gap, a space where history suggests something should exist, but where physical evidence has yet to confirm it. A life recorded, an ending described, a burial implied, but a location still unknown, and that absence. The tomb that doesn't clearly belong to anyone, KV-55. A tomb uncovered, artifacts inside, a burial present, the kind of find that usually brings clarity. But in this case, it didn't, because almost immediately something felt off. This is KV-55. And what makes it stand out is not just what was found inside, but how little agreement there is about who it belonged to, because the evidence points in different directions, creating a situation where identification is possible, but not certain, and that changes everything. The tomb itself is relatively small, not as elaborate as others in the same area, with a layout that feels incomplete, suggesting that it may not have been intended as a final resting place in its current form, and that first impression matters, because it sets the tone. Inside the tomb, a burial was found, but the condition was unusual. The remains were present, but the context around them did not fully align with expectations, creating uncertainty about identity, and that uncertainty is central, because it defines the entire subject. The objects within the tomb add complexity, because some of them appear to belong to different individuals, suggesting that items may have been moved, reused, or repurposed, and that mixture creates confusion, because it breaks consistency. The inscriptions, where present, are not always clear, some damaged, some incomplete, meaning that direct identification through text is limited, and that limitation adds difficulty, because it removes one of the most reliable forms of evidence. The structure of the tomb itself does not fully match the status expected for certain individuals, raising questions about whether it was originally intended for someone else, and that possibility introduces change, because it suggests that the tomb may have been reassigned. The remains found inside have been studied, examined, compared. But conclusions vary, because physical analysis provides data, but interpretation depends on context, which is not fully consistent. And that variation keeps the discussion open. The historical period connected to KV-55 is complex, marked by transitions, changes in leadership, shifts in practices, and that context affects how the tomb is understood, because it shows that the environment was not stable. The idea that the tomb could have been modified after its initial use adds another layer, because alterations can change the original meaning, making it harder to reconstruct the initial intention. And that possibility reflects process, because it shows that structures can evolve. The absence of a clear, singular identity is what defines this tomb, because while there are strong possibilities, none are confirmed beyond doubt. And that lack of certainty creates the mystery, because it leaves space between evidence and conclusion. The condition of the burial elements suggests that the tomb may not have remained untouched, because disturbances, whether intentional or not, can alter the arrangement of objects and remains, and that disturbance affects interpretation, because it changes context. The combination of mixed artifacts, unclear inscriptions, and debated identity creates a situation where each piece of evidence must be considered carefully, without relying on a single factor, and that complexity defines the subject, because it shows that understanding requires multiple layers. Even now, KV-55 remains a point of discussion, studied, re-examined, with new methods applied but no final consensus reached, and that persistence keeps it relevant. The contrast between discovery and clarity is what defines this tomb, because it was found but not fully understood, and that difference creates impact, because it shows that discovery does not always resolve uncertainty. The idea that a tomb can exist without a confirmed identity challenges expectation, because burial sites are often associated with individuals. But here, that connection is not fully established, and that gap creates tension, because it shows that not everything fits neatly into place, and maybe that is what makes KV-55 stand out, not because it lacks evidence, but because the evidence does not align in a single direction. A tomb that contains information, but not a clear answer, a space where identity remains uncertain, a burial present, artifacts surrounding it, a structure that holds clues, but no definitive conclusion, and that uncertainty. The monoliths that were carved, moved and raised with precision, Egyptian obelisks, tall, narrow, rising upward from a single base, tapering toward a point, creating a shape that feels clean, controlled, almost effortless in appearance. But that simplicity is misleading, because nothing about them is easy. These are Egyptian obelisks, and what makes them stand out is not just their form, but how they were made, because each one is carved from a single block of stone, shaped with precision, transported over distance and then raised into position without breaking, and that changes everything. The process begins at the quarry, a single piece of stone selected, not assembled, not layered, but one continuous mass that has to be separated from the surrounding rock without fracturing, and that step alone requires control, because once the stone cracks, it cannot be used. The surface of unfinished obelisks shows the method, channels cut around the shape, sections removed gradually, allowing the form to emerge from the rock rather than being built separately. And that approach reflects technique, because it shows that shaping begins before extraction is complete. The stone itself is often granite, dense, hard, resistant, which means shaping it requires sustained effort, repeated action, and consistency across the entire surface. And that effort reflects planning, because it shows that the process is controlled. The sides of the obelisk are flat, smooth, aligned, creating a structure that maintains straight edges over a long vertical distance, and that alignment is important, because it ensures stability. The tapering toward the top is gradual, consistent, not abrupt, indicating that proportion was carefully managed, not estimated, and that proportion reflects measurement, because it shows that the shape follows a system. Once the obelisk is shaped, it must be moved, and that introduces the next challenge, because transporting a single heavy stone over distance requires coordination, a method that allows weight to be managed without losing control. And that process reflects organization, because it shows that movement is planned. The use of sled-like systems is one explanation, allowing the stone to be pulled across prepared surfaces, reducing friction and maintaining direction. And that method reflects efficiency, because it works with weight rather than against it. The journey does not end at transport, because once the obelisk reaches its destination, it must be raised. And that is one of the most complex steps, because lifting a tall, heavy object into a vertical position requires balance, control, a sequence that ensures the stone does not fall or fracture, and that sequence reflects understanding, because it shows that the process is structured, the base into which the obelisk is placed must be prepared, levelled, aligned, so that once the stone is upright it remains stable, and that preparation is critical, because it supports the final form. The positioning of obelisks within their environment is not random. They are placed with alignment in mind, orientation, relationship to surrounding structures, indicating that placement is part of a larger design, and that design reflects intention, because it shows that the obelisk is part of a system. The surface of the finished obelisk is often polished, refined, creating a smooth exterior that reflects light, suggesting that appearance was considered alongside structure. And that finish adds another layer, because it shows that the final result matters. The consistency across multiple obelisks suggests that the process was repeatable, because similar forms appear in different locations, indicating that the method was not isolated. And that repetition reflects knowledge, because it shows that the technique was understood. The absence of large structural failure in many surviving obelisks indicates that the methods used were effective, because these structures remain standing, maintaining their form over long periods, and that durability reflects success. Even now, obelisks remain standing, aligned, their surfaces still defined, allowing them to be observed, measured, studied. And that persistence keeps them relevant. The contrast between simplicity and complexity is what defines these structures, because they appear simple, but the process behind them is not. And that difference creates impact, because it shows that controlled design can produce powerful results. And maybe that is what makes Egyptian obelisks stand out, not just because of their height, but because of how they are made, objects carved from a single piece, shaped with precision, moved with coordination, and raised with control. A single stone, transformed, placed upright, still standing, and that precision,